The air in the television studio was thick, not with the usual buzz of political debate, but with a strange, heavy silence. It was a silence that felt like a held breath, a collective pause before a storm. The lights were hot, unnaturally bright, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the forced smiles and confident postures of the people on stage. In the center of it all sat Donald Trump, a man who had built an empire on an image of unshakable confidence. He leaned back in his chair, a picture of relaxed power, a king in his court. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett, a woman whose name was synonymous with sharp, relentless truth, watched him. She wasn't smiling. Her eyes, clear and focused, held a quiet intensity that seemed to cut through the artificial brightness of the studio. The moderator, a seasoned journalist who had seen it all, tried to steer the conversation along its planned course, asking questions about the economy, about foreign policy, about the endless cycle of political promises. But the words felt hollow, like echoes in a vast, empty chamber. Something else was present in that room, an unspoken tension, a secret that pulsed beneath the surface of the polite, televised exchange. The audience, both in the studio and at home, could feel it. It was a low hum of anticipation, a feeling that the carefully constructed reality of the show was about to be shattered. Every camera was perfectly positioned, every microphone perfectly calibrated, ready to capture the expected drama of political theater. But no one was prepared for the drama that was about to unfold. No one could have predicted that in just a few short minutes, the world would witness not a political debate, but a public unraveling, a collapse so sudden, so complete, that it would be seared into the collective memory of a nation. The stage was set, not for a discussion, but for a reckoning. And the countdown had already begun. Jasmine Crockett's voice, when she began to speak, was calm, almost gentle. It was a stark contrast to the booming, declarative tones of her opponent. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words, carefully chosen, carried a weight of their own. She started with a simple question, a seemingly innocuous inquiry about financial transparency, about the intricate web of connections that bind the powerful to one another. It was a question that, on the surface, seemed like standard political fare. But beneath the surface, it was a carefully laid trap. Trump, ever the performer, responded with his usual bluster. He waved his hand dismissively, a gesture he had used 1,000 times before to brush away inconvenient questions. He launched into a familiar tirade about his success, his wealth, his unparalleled business acumen. He was a master of deflection, a magician who could make any uncomfortable truth disappear in a puff of self-aggrandizing smoke. But this time, the magic wasn't working. Crockett listened patiently, her expression unchanging. She let him finish, let the echoes of his booming voice fade into the tense silence of the studio. And then she spoke again. Her voice was still calm, but now there was a new edge to it, a glint of steel. She mentioned a name that had been whispered in the darkest corners of the internet, a name that was synonymous with wealth, power, and unspeakable crimes. The name was Jeffrey Epstein. For a split second, the mask of confidence on Trump's face slipped. It was a barely perceptible flicker, a momentary tightening of the jaw, a sudden coldness in his eyes. He recovered quickly, a forced smile plastered back on his face. He tried to laugh it off, to dismiss the name as irrelevant, as a desperate, pathetic attempt to smear him. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The first crack had appeared in the fortress of his denial. The audience could feel the shift, the sudden, sharp intake of breath that seemed to ripple through the studio. The moderator, sensing the change in temperature, tried to intervene, to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But it was too late. The train had left the station, and it was hurtling towards a destination that no one could have foreseen. Crockett pressed on, her questions becoming more specific, more pointed. She was no longer asking about abstract concepts of transparency and accountability. She was asking about dates, about places, about specific financial transactions. She was weaving a net, and with every question, the net grew tighter. She spoke of a private island, of a web of shell corporations, of a pattern of behavior that pointed to a dark, disturbing truth. Trump's denials became more frantic, more desperate. His voice, once so full of booming confidence, was now strained, tinged with a note of panic. He started to fidget in his chair, his hands clenching and unclenching. The sweat on his brow was no longer a product of the hot studio lights. It was the cold sweat of fear. He tried to attack, to turn the tables on Crockett, to paint her as a liar, a political hack. But his attacks lacked their usual force. They were the desperate flailings of a man who knew he was trapped. The audience watched, mesmerized, as the drama unfolded. This was no longer a political debate. It was a public interrogation, a live broadcast of a man's carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The flashes of documents on the screen, the snippets of headlines, the subtle but undeniable evidence that Crockett presented, all combined to create a damning portrait of a man with a terrible secret. The air in the studio was thick with the unspoken, with the weight of a truth that was about to be fully revealed. The tension was a physical thing, a palpable force that seemed to press down on everyone in the room. The storm was no longer brewing. It was here. And it was about to break with a fury that would shake the very foundations of power. Then came the moment that would be replayed a million times, the moment that would define the night, the moment that would change everything. Crockett, her voice now ringing with a quiet, powerful authority, delivered the final blow. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, backed by irrefutable evidence. She laid out the details of Trump's connection to Epstein, the financial ties, the shared social circles, the pattern of behavior that was too consistent to be a coincidence. She spoke of a secret that had been buried for years, a secret that had been protected by a wall of money and power. And as she spoke, the camera zoomed in on Trump's face. The transformation was shocking. The mask of defiance shattered, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated terror. His eyes, wide and staring, seemed to see not the studio lights, but the ghosts of his past. His mouth hung open, a silent scream trapped in his throat. His body, once so full of blustering energy, was now rigid, frozen in a state of shock. The studio fell into a deafening silence. The only sound was the frantic, desperate beating of a single heart, a heart that was about to give out under the immense pressure of a lifetime of secrets. The ticking clock, a silent observer of the unfolding drama, seemed to mock the man who had once boasted of his timeless power. The seconds ticked by, each one an eternity, each one a nail in the coffin of his carefully constructed legacy. The world watched, holding its breath, as the full weight of the revelation settled upon the man who had once seemed untouchable. The nuclear bomb had detonated, and the fallout was just beginning. 7 minutes. That's how long it took. 7 minutes from the moment Crockett first uttered the name Epstein, to the moment Trump's world came crashing down. The collapse was not sudden, not a dramatic, theatrical fall. It was a slow, agonizing descent into oblivion. His body, which had been so rigid with shock, began to crumple. It was as if the strings that had been holding him up had been cut, one by one. His head slumped forward, his shoulders sagged, his hands, which had been clenched into tight fists, went limp. His eyes, which had been wide with terror, rolled back in his head, leaving only the whites visible. A low, guttural sound escaped his lips, a sound of pure, animalistic despair. He was a man broken, a man defeated, a man who had been stripped bare in front of the entire world. The studio audience gasped, a collective sound of shock and pity. The moderator, for the first time in his long and storied career, was speechless. He could only stare, his face a mask of disbelief. The paramedics rushed to the stage, their faces grim, their movements urgent. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The man who had once been the most powerful person in the world was now a pathetic, broken figure, a symbol of the corrupting influence of power and the ultimate triumph of truth. The image of his collapse, broadcast live to millions, would become an iconic symbol of a new era, an era in which secrets could no longer be buried, an era in which the powerful would be held accountable for their sins. The 7 minutes that shook the world had come to an end, but the aftershocks would be felt for years to come. The chaos that erupted in the studio was nothing compared to the chaos that erupted online. The clip of Trump's collapse went viral in an instant, spreading like a digital wildfire across every social media platform. Hashtags like #TrumpCollapse and #EpsteinTruth trended worldwide, a testament to the global impact of the event. People shared the clip with a mixture of shock, outrage, and a grim sense of satisfaction. The internet, which had once been a breeding ground for conspiracy theories and misinformation, was now a forum for a global conversation about truth, justice, and the abuse of power. News channels around the world interrupted their regular programming to report on the story, their anchors struggling to find the words to describe the unprecedented events that had just unfolded. Pundits and political analysts, who had once been so confident in their predictions, were now left scrambling to make sense of a world that had been turned upside down. The story was on the front page of every newspaper, the lead item on every news broadcast. It was a story that transcended politics, a story that spoke to the very heart of what it means to be human. It was a story about the corrupting influence of power, the corrosive nature of secrets, and the ultimate triumph of truth. And at the center of it all was Jasmine Crockett, the woman who had dared to speak truth to power, the woman who had single-handedly brought down a titan. She was hailed as a hero, a modern-day David who had slain Goliath. Her name was on everyone's lips, her face on every screen. She had become a symbol of hope, a beacon of light in a world that had grown dark with lies and deceit. The 7 minutes that had changed the world had also created a new hero, a new icon for a new generation. Amidst the chaos and the adulation, Jasmine Crockett remained a figure of quiet dignity and grace. She did not gloat. She did not celebrate. She simply stood her ground, her expression a mixture of sadness and resolve. She had not set out to destroy a man. She had set out to reveal the truth. And she had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. But she knew that this was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The collapse of one man, however powerful, would not be enough to cleanse the world of the corruption that had taken root. There were other powerful men, other dark secrets, other victims who were still waiting for justice. And so, she stood tall, a silent promise to continue the fight, to continue to speak truth to power, no matter the cost. She was a warrior, a truth seeker, a woman who had found her voice and was not afraid to use it. And in the quiet strength of her resolve, the world found a new reason to hope. The aftershocks of the 7-minute earthquake were still being felt, but in the rubble of the old world, a new world was beginning to be born, a world in which the truth, once spoken, could never be silenced. The consequences of that night were swift and far-reaching. The stock market plummeted, a reflection of the uncertainty and instability that had been unleashed. Political alliances were shattered, careers were destroyed, and reputations were left in tatters. The Epstein scandal, which had once been a fringe conspiracy theory, was now a mainstream news story, a topic of conversation in every home, every office, every corner of the world. The dominoes began to fall, one by one, as more and more powerful men were implicated in the scandal. The world watched, horrified and fascinated, as the full extent of the corruption was revealed. It was a story of greed, of power, of a secret society of men who believed they were above the law. But it was also a story of courage, of resilience, of the victims who had dared to speak out, who had refused to be silenced. Their voices, once so faint, were now a mighty roar, a chorus of truth that could not be ignored. The world was changing, and it was changing for the better. The 7 minutes that had shaken the world had also awakened it, had forced it to confront the darkness that had been lurking in its midst. And in that confrontation, there was hope. Hope for a future in which the powerful would be held accountable, in which the victims would be heard, in which the truth would always prevail. The echoes of that fateful broadcast lingered in the air, a phantom presence in every newsroom, every political discussion, every hushed conversation. The image of the collapse, replayed countless times, became a symbol, a stark reminder that even the most formidable walls of power could crumble under the weight of undeniable truth. But the story was far from over. The initial shock gave way to a relentless pursuit of answers, a collective demand for accountability that resonated from the smallest towns to the grandest capitals. Journalists, once hesitant to delve too deeply into the shadowy world of the powerful, now found themselves emboldened, their pens and cameras sharpened by the public's insatiable hunger for justice. The name Epstein, once a whispered taboo, was now shouted from the rooftops, a rallying cry for those who had long suffered in silence. The victims, once marginalized and dismissed, found their voices amplified, their stories finally heard by a world that could no longer turn a blind eye. Their pain, their courage, became a powerful force, fueling the fire of investigation and demanding retribution for decades of unpunished crimes. The legal system, often criticized for its slow pace and its perceived bias towards the wealthy, was now under intense scrutiny. Prosecutors, once cautious, felt the immense pressure of public opinion, their every move scrutinized, their every decision weighed against the backdrop of a global outcry. The wheels of justice, though slow, began to turn with a new, determined momentum. Subpoenas were issued, testimonies were taken, and the intricate web of connections that had protected the powerful for so long began to unravel, thread by painstaking thread. The world watched, captivated, as the layers of deceit were peeled back, revealing a landscape of corruption far more extensive and deeply entrenched than anyone had dared to imagine. It was a dark tapestry woven with threads of money, influence, and unspeakable acts, a testament to the insidious nature of unchecked power. The legacy of that night is still being written. The story is far from over. But one thing is certain, the world will never be the same. The 7 minutes that changed everything will forever be remembered as a turning point in history, a moment when the truth, in all its raw, unvarnished power, broke through the screen and shattered the illusions of a generation. It was a moment of reckoning, a moment of catharsis, a moment of hope. And it was a moment that proved, once and for all, that no secret is safe, no power is absolute, and no lie can live forever. The truth, in the end, will always find a way. And when it does, it has the power to change the world.